That rainy October night turned the rural road into a black and treacherous mirror. Richard Parker adjusted his platinum Patek Philippe watch on his wrist, a nervous habit he had developed over the years, as his Mercedes S-Class sliced through the darkness. At 72 he had achieved everything money could buy, but loneliness remained his constant companion. The rhythmic sound of the windshield wipers marked time like an unrelenting metronome, reminding Richard of the countless lonely nights he had endured since his wife Helen's passing 5 years ago. The briefcase on the passenger seat held over $2 million in bearer bonds, a sum that once would have brought him satisfaction but now felt as empty as his 12-bedroom mansion. His wrinkled hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he reflected on the business dinner he had just left. Another night of fake smiles and shallow conversations with people who only cared about his wealth. The rain intensified, turning the road into an even greater challenge for his tired eyes. The luxurious interior of the Mercedes couldn't dispel the emptiness consuming him. The soft glow of digital screens on the dashboard displayed information he barely registered. The GPS indicated another 40 minutes to reach his home, 40 minutes of forced solitude that made him question every choice that had brought him to this point. A sharp and sudden bang shattered his melancholic contemplation. The rear right tire had blown, sending the car into a violent skid. Richard tried to regain control, but his aged hands betrayed his reflexes. The Mercedes spun like an out-of-control top, and the world around him blurred into a whirl of lights and shadows. The impact was brutal. Twisted metal groaned in protest as the car slammed into the guardrail, spinning several times before finally coming to a halt. The last thing Richard saw before losing consciousness was his briefcase bursting open, scattering a fortune in papers across the interior of the vehicle. In his unconscious moments, fragments of memories danced through his mind. Helen smiling in her rose garden, his son Thomas leaving for college, broken promises to spend more time with his family. Each memory pierced his heart with the sting of regret. When awareness began to return, it came in disjointed pieces. First, the relentless drumming of rain on the crumpled metal. Then a searing pain in his right leg. Finally, a young and steady voice cut through the fog of his disorientation. "Sir? Can you hear me? Please don't move." Richard opened his eyes with difficulty, meeting the concerned face of a young black man who couldn't have been older than 20. The young man knelt beside him, pressing something against his injured leg to staunch the bleeding. His eyes were kind and resolute, exuding a calm that seemed out of place in the chaotic scene. "The briefcase?" Richard murmured, his mind still fixated on the exposed fortune. "Don't worry about that now," the young man replied, keeping firm pressure on the wound. "My name's Marcus. I was heading home from work when I saw the crash. You're lucky, this stretch of road is usually deserted at this hour." Richard studied the young man with growing clarity. Marcus wore a simple janitor's uniform, now stained with mud and blood. Around them, papers worth millions danced in the wind and rain, yet the young man didn't spare them a glance. His entire focus was on tending to Richard's injury. The contrast between the situation and Marcus's attitude was surreal. Here was a young man, likely struggling to make ends meet on minimum wage, completely ignoring a fortune scattered at his feet, concerned only with saving the life of a stranger. Why are you helping me?" Richard asked, his trembling voice betraying not only physical pain but also profound bewilderment. Marcus answered without hesitation, his hands never leaving their task. "Because it's the right thing to do, sir. I couldn't just pass by and pretend I didn't see anything. My mom always taught me to help anyone in need, no matter who they are." The simplicity and sincerity of that response hit Richard like a second impact, as powerful as the crash itself. Here he was, a man who had spent decades building walls with his wealth, being saved by someone who likely earned less in a month than the value of the watch on his wrist. The rain continued to pour, but Marcus remained steadfast, doing everything he could to protect Richard. His skilled hands had improvised a tourniquet from his own shirt, and his eyes constantly monitored the older man's vital signs. Sirens began wailing in the distance, drawing closer with every passing second. Marcus had called an ambulance before even starting first aid. "Help is on the way," he assured with a calm smile. "You're going to be fine." Richard felt something stir in his chest, an emotion he hadn't experienced in years. It was a blend of gratitude and shame, admiration and regret. Here was a young man who had every opportunity to take advantage of the situation. The open briefcase, the expensive watch, the gold chain around Richard's neck, but instead chose compassion without a moment's hesitation. The flashing lights of the ambulance began to illuminate the scene in alternating red and blue, casting dancing shadows across the surrounding trees. As the paramedics approached, Richard gripped Marcus's arm with surprising strength. What's your full name, son?" "Marcus Williams, sir," the young man replied, beginning to step aside to make room for the medical team. "Don't go," Richard pleaded, his voice laced with a surprising urgency that startled them both. "Please? I need to speak with you later." Marcus hesitated, glancing at his soaked uniform and checking the time. It was late and his janitorial shift had ended hours ago. But something in the older man's eyes made him nod. "I'll come by the hospital as soon as I can, Mr. Parker," he promised, having seen the name on the wallet he had used to cushion Richard's head while they waited for help. As the paramedics worked swiftly to stabilize Richard and prepare him for transport, his gaze remained fixed on Marcus. The young man stayed nearby, braving the rain as he helped collect the scattered papers and carefully placed them back into the briefcase, never once showing the slightest interest in their immense value. It was in that moment, lying on the stretcher as he was wheeled into the ambulance, that Richard Parker, a man who had spent his entire life measuring worth in dollars and cents, experienced his first true epiphany in decades. He had witnessed something his wealth could never buy, the true richness of the human soul. The ambulance sped off into the rainy night, leaving Marcus alone on the deserted road. The young man watched the flashing lights fade into the distance, unaware that this seemingly chance encounter was about to change not only his life but also the way Richard Parker viewed the world and the people around him. The cold light of the hospital room cast a pale glow over Richard Parker's tired face. After emergency surgery to repair his injured leg, he was left alone with his thoughts. The digital clock on the wall read 3:47 a.m., but sleep evaded him like an old adversary. In a nearby chair, his salvaged briefcase rested intact. Marcus had personally handed it to the head nurse, ensuring it reached its owner safely. Not a single document was missing, a detail that Richard couldn't stop replaying in his mind. The private hospital room with its first-class amenities felt oddly stifling. Richard pressed the button to adjust the bed, trying to find a comfortable position. His thoughts kept circling back to Marcus, the young man whose integrity stood in stark contrast to the hollow exchanges Richard was used to in his business dealings. A soft knock on the door interrupted his musings. The night nurse, Lisa, entered quietly. "Mr. Parker, that young man is here again. I know visiting hours are over, but he's insisting on checking on you." Richard felt his heart quicken slightly. "Marcus? Please let him in." Moments later, Marcus stepped into the room. He had changed out of his stained uniform into simple yet clean clothes, faded jeans and a white t-shirt. Despite the evident fatigue on his face, his eyes still held that unmistakable spark of genuine concern. "Mr. Parker," Marcus greeted respectfully, staying near the door. "Sorry to come so late. I just finished my second job and wanted to make sure you were okay." Richard motioned for him to come closer. "Second job? You never take a break, do you, young man?" Marcus gave a shy smile as he stepped toward the bed. "I can't afford to, sir. I work as a janitor during the day at the business center and do restaurant deliveries at night. I have to help my mom with the bills, she's sick." The simplicity with which Marcus spoke about his struggles struck a deep chord in Richard. There was no bitterness in his tone, just a quiet determination. "Have a seat, Marcus," Richard said, gesturing to the chair beside the bed. "Tell me more about yourself and your mom." For a moment, Marcus hesitated as if he wasn't used to discussing his personal life. But something in Richard's gaze encouraged him to go on. "My mom, Sarah, she has multiple sclerosis," Marcus began, sitting on the edge of the chair. "She was diagnosed 3 years ago. It's been a constant struggle since then. The medications are expensive, and the insurance doesn't cover all the treatments. But she's strong, you know? Even on her bad days, she still finds a way to smile." Richard listened intently as Marcus spoke. The young man described his grueling routine, waking up at 5 in the morning, working as a janitor until 2 in the afternoon, rushing to make deliveries until midnight, and still finding time to care for his mom in between. "And your father?" Richard asked softly. Marcus lowered his gaze for a moment. "He left us when I was 12. One day he just walked out and never came back. It's been just me and my mom ever since." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Richard thought of his own son, Thomas, who had barely spoken to him since Helen's passing. How many times had he himself been absent, prioritizing business meetings over family moments? "You know, Mr. Parker," Marcus continued, his voice low but resolute, "some people tell me I should place my mom in a state facility. They say it would be easier. But I can't do that to her. She sacrificed everything for me when I was a kid. Now it's my turn to take care of her, Richard felt a lump form in his throat. What about college? Do you have any plans to study? A sad smile crossed Marcus's face. I had a partial scholarship for engineering. I even attended for a semester, but when Mom got sick, well, I had to make a choice. Books can wait, her health can't. Their conversation was interrupted by Nurse Lisa, who gently reminded them that visiting hours had ended long ago. Marcus stood, straightening his worn t-shirt. I need to go, Mr. Parker. My mom's probably worried and I have to be up early tomorrow. Before Marcus could leave, Richard reached out and gripped his arm. Wait, you saved my life last night, Marcus. And not just that, you also saved something very precious to me. He gestured toward the briefcase containing the bonds. Why didn't you take anything? You must have seen what was inside. Marcus squared his shoulders, and for a moment, Richard saw in him a dignity that no amount of wealth could buy. It wasn't mine to take, Mr. Parker. Besides, my mom always says that character is what you do when no one's watching. Richard felt his eyes fill with tears, something that hadn't happened since Helen's funeral. You're an extraordinary man, Marcus Williams. Marcus smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his tired face. I'm just trying to do the right thing, sir. Rest and recover. Maybe I can visit you again tomorrow if you'd like. After Marcus left, Richard lay awake for a long time, his thoughts a whirlwind of emotions and memories. Here was a young man who had every reason to be bitter about life, to take ethical shortcuts, to resent the privileges of others. Yet, he displayed an integrity and strength of character that made Richard question every value he had built his materially successful life upon. That night, while the city slept outside, Richard Parker began to formulate a plan. It wouldn't just be a matter of financial recompense. That would be too easy, too shallow. No, he needed to do something more meaningful, something that honored the noble spirit he had witnessed in this extraordinary young man. With the determination of someone who had finally found purpose after years of drifting, Richard started to plan how he could not only change Marcus's life but also, in the process, redeem his own soul. The next morning, Richard Parker's hospital room looked different. A stack of folders and documents covered the rolling table over his bed, and his personal laptop had been brought in by his assistant. As the doctors made their morning rounds, he was already immersed in research about multiple sclerosis and available treatments. Mr. Parker, you should be resting, Dr. Thompson warned, frowning at the workload spread across the bed. Richard simply smiled, a smile he hadn't shown in years. Doctor, I've never felt more energized. In fact, I need your help. What do you know about treatment centers for multiple sclerosis? Over the next several hours, Richard dove into a world he had never considered before. Calls were made, specialists consulted, and a clear picture began to take shape in his mind. The treatment that Sarah Williams, Marcus's mother, needed existed, but it was far beyond the financial reach of most people. As he organized his notes, a familiar knock sounded at the door. Marcus entered, still wearing his janitor's uniform, carrying a small package. Good morning, Mr. Parker. I brought something for you, he said, revealing a simple but homemade breakfast. My mom insisted on making this when she heard you were alone in the hospital. Richard felt a lump in his throat. Even with all their struggles, that family still found time to care for a stranger. Your mother is very kind, Marcus. Please thank her for me. Marcus noticed the papers scattered around. You're already working? Shouldn't you be resting? Come here, Marcus. I need to talk to you. Richard gestured to the chair beside the bed. How is your mother today? Marcus's face darkened slightly. Today's one of the bad days. She had trouble getting out of bed, but she insisted on making this breakfast for you. That's just how she is, always thinking of others. Richard took a deep breath. Marcus, I want to do something for you and your mother. Mr. Parker, there's no need. Marcus began to protest, but Richard raised his hand, interrupting him. Let me finish. It's not charity, it's a repayment. You saved my life on that road, but you did more than that. You showed me something I had forgotten long ago, the value of humanity. Richard picked up one of the folders on his desk. There's a clinic specializing in multiple sclerosis treatment. They have a promising experimental program that has shown excellent results. I want your mother to be treated there. Marcus paled. Mr. Parker, I'm grateful, but I can't accept that. A treatment like that must cost a fortune. Money is not the issue, Richard replied firmly. The issue is that you and your mother continue to suffer when there is a solution available. But Marcus remained hesitant. You don't know me, you don't know my mother. Why would you do this for us? Richard gazed out the hospital window for a moment, gathering his thoughts. You know, Marcus, I spent my whole life accumulating wealth. I built a financial empire, but in the process I lost something far more valuable: my humanity. My wife died 5 years ago and my son barely speaks to me. I had everything money could buy, but I was utterly alone. He turned his gaze back to Marcus. That night, on the road, you could have taken anything: the briefcase, my watch, my wallet. Instead, you chose to save the life of a stranger. That made me realize there is a wealth that cannot be measured in dollars. Marcus listened in silence, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'm not offering charity, Richard continued. I'm offering a chance to do the right thing. Your mother deserves the best possible treatment, and you deserve the chance to return to college. At that moment, the door to the room opened again and a nurse entered, pushing a wheelchair. A middle-aged woman, thin but with vibrant eyes, smiled at them. Mom? Marcus exclaimed, surprised. What are you doing here? Sarah Williams smiled at her son. Mr. Parker invited me. I thought it was time to meet the man my son helped. Richard watched as Marcus hurried to assist his mother. Despite her weakened physical condition, Sarah exuded an inner strength that reminded him so much of her son. Her movements were slow and deliberate, but there was a graceful dignity in every gesture. Mr. Parker, Sarah began, her voice soft but firm, my son told me what happened that night. I want you to know that he's been this way since he was little, always thinking of others before himself. I could see that, Mrs. Williams, Richard replied, noticing how Marcus gently held his mother's hand. That's why I'm determined to help you both. Sarah studied Richard for a moment, as if she could see beyond his wealth and status. You know, Mr. Parker, sometimes life puts us on the right path through the most unexpected circumstances. Maybe this encounter wasn't just for Marcus and me. Sarah's words hit Richard deeply. She was right. This meeting was changing something fundamental inside him, awakening feelings and values he had long forgotten. But before Richard could respond, an alarm sounded from the heart monitor beside his bed. His blood pressure had risen dangerously, and within seconds the room was filled with nurses and doctors. Marcus and Sarah were quickly escorted out, leaving Richard to battle a new threat to his health. As the medical team worked to stabilize him, Richard kept his eyes fixed on the door where Marcus and Sarah had just left. He couldn't fail now, not when he had finally found a real purpose for his wealth and his life. The following days in the hospital were a painful mix of physical recovery and intense planning for Richard. After the scare with his blood pressure, the doctors insisted on more detailed tests, revealing a truth he had tried to ignore. His heart was much more damaged than they had initially thought. The nights grew increasingly lonely, punctuated only by the constant beeping of the heart monitors and the occasional whisper of nurses in the hallway. Mr. Parker, Dr. Thompson explained on a particularly sunny morning, his face carrying a seriousness that made Richard sit up in bed. You need to slow down. I'm not saying this as a suggestion, it's a medical order. The stress is literally killing you. The latest tests show significant damage to your heart muscle. Richard, sitting on the edge of his hospital bed, methodically adjusted the tie his assistant had brought him. Even while hospitalized, he maintained his impeccable appearance. A deeply ingrained habit from decades in the corporate world, like armor against the vulnerability he felt inside. Doctor, for the first time in years, I'm not stressed. I'm truly energized. The doctor sighed heavily, recognizing that determined gleam in his patient's eyes, the same look he saw in workaholic executives who ignored every warning sign until it was too late. Just promise me you'll take care of yourself. Your blood pressure is still not fully under control, and the risk of a heart attack is real. In the hallway, Marcus paced nervously back and forth, the worn soles of his shoes marking an anxious rhythm on the hospital floor. He had begged for time off from his janitorial job to accompany his mother to an appointment with the specialist Richard had contacted. Sarah was being examined at that moment, and each minute of waiting felt like an eternity. His hands couldn't stop twisting the worn cap he held, as his mind raced with worries about the diagnosis and the uncertain future. Marcus, Richard's voice called from the door, weaker than usual, but still carrying that natural authority. Come here for a moment. The young man entered, finding Richard sitting in an armchair by the window, surrounded by papers and his laptop like a general planning his next battle. The sunlight created a halo around him, highlighting how much weight he had lost in the past few days. How is your mother? Still in consultation, Marcus replied, his voice betraying the anxiety he felt. The doctors are doing several tests. I've never seen so many specialists together. I'm scared, Mr. Parker. What if they find something worse? Richard smiled gently, recognizing in Marcus's concerns the same fear he had felt when Helen fell ill. They are the best in the field, Marcus. Trust them. He picked up a folder from the table and extended it to the young man, his hands trembling slightly with the effort. "While we wait, I want you to take a look at this." Marcus opened the folder, his eyes widening, his heart skipping a beat. It was his old college engineering documentation, along with readmission forms already filled out. Each page represented a dream he had been forced to abandon, a future that seemed lost forever. "Mr. Parker, I've already told you I can't go back to studying now." His voice faltered. "I need to take care of my mother and—" "Marcus," Richard interrupted with a firmness that surprised them both, leaning forward with intensity. "You can't take care of your mother if you don't take care of your own future. Her treatment is secured. I've taken care of everything. Now it's time for you to pursue your dreams again. Your mother wouldn't want to see you sacrificing your future forever." The young man sat heavily in the chair nearby, his hands visibly trembling as he held the documents. Memories of his nights studying under the dim light of a worn lamp, dreaming of a better future, flooded his mind. "But what about my jobs? The bills? I can't just—" Richard leaned even further forward, ignoring the sharp pain in his chest. "I have an offer for you. My company has an internship program for engineering students. The pay is good, better than your 2 current jobs combined, and the hours are flexible to allow for your studies. Also," he paused meaningfully, watching Marcus's reaction, "we offer full health insurance for the intern and their dependents." Marcus felt his emotions overwhelm him, years of struggle and sacrifice weighing in each tear that silently slid down his face. The possibility of a different future, one that had always seemed so distant, was now within reach, right in front of him. "Why?" he managed to ask, his voice choked. "Why are you doing all of this?" Richard stood up with visible difficulty and walked to the window, each step measured and careful. The morning sun bathed the city outside, casting a golden glow on the buildings he had spent his life building and acquiring. "You know, Marcus, I spent 50 years building a fortune. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. But that night on the road, I realized I was completely bankrupt when it comes to what truly matters." He turned to face the young man, his eyes shining with a mix of emotion and determination. "You showed me something I had forgotten, that a person's true worth is not in their bank account but in their character. I saw in you the son I could have had, if I hadn't been so busy building empires." Before Marcus could respond, a nurse appeared at the door, her face tense with urgency. "Mr. Williams? Your mother is asking for you. The doctors want to speak with both of you, now." The nurse's tone made Marcus's blood run cold. He stood up quickly, looking anxiously at Richard, like a son seeking support from his father. Do you want to come with me?" "I don't know if I can hear what they have to say alone." Richard felt his heart tighten with the request, not with physical pain this time, but with a deep emotion he hadn't felt in a long time. "Are you sure?" "You're already part of our family now," Marcus replied with a trembling but sincere smile. "Please?" Together, they walked down the hallway to the consultation room, each step echoing with the weight of expectation. Sarah was sitting in her wheelchair, surrounded by 3 doctors who were gesturing over tests and charts spread out on the table. But it was her face, lit up by a smile Marcus hadn't seen in a long time, that immediately caught everyone's attention. "Son," she exclaimed upon seeing him, her eyes shining with renewed hope. "Mr. Parker, you need to hear this. The doctors say there's a new experimental treatment that could really help. They think I might regain some of the movement I've lost." The joy on Sarah's face was contagious, turning the tense atmosphere into something lighter, more hopeful. Marcus kneeled beside her chair, holding her hand as if it were the most precious thing in the world, while the doctors explained the details of the experimental treatment. Richard watched the scene with a growing sense of peace, mixed with an urgency he couldn't explain. For the first time in years, he felt that his money was serving a greater purpose than simply accumulating more wealth. It was transforming lives, bringing back hope, creating possibilities. However, as everyone celebrated the good news, Richard felt a sharp, familiar pang in his chest, stronger than all the previous ones. His vision darkened for a moment, and he had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. The world around him began to spin, and the sound of joyful voices was replaced by a distant buzzing. No one noticed his moment of weakness. Everyone was absorbed in the doctor's explanations about the new treatment, the possibilities of recovery, the brighter future ahead. Richard took a deep breath, forcing himself to maintain composure, swallowing the pain that threatened to overwhelm him. There was still so much to be done, so much to be organized, secured, insured. He needed to make sure Marcus and Sarah were protected, that his plans would come to fruition, that his legacy would be more than just money in a bank account. Time, he realized with a chilling clarity, might be running out faster than he had imagined. Richard Parker's private office on the 55th floor was a monument to corporate success. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, while rare artworks adorned the walls. After 2 weeks in the hospital, he had finally returned to work, against medical advice. "Mr. Parker, the board is concerned," said Jennifer Myers, his executive assistant for 20 years, watching her boss shift restlessly in his Italian leather chair. "The changes you're proposing are drastic." Richard adjusted his tie, feeling the weight of the heart monitor hidden beneath his shirt. "Drastic are the inequalities we've ignored for so long, Jennifer. How much did we spend last year on executive bonuses?" "About 47 million, sir." "And how much did we invest in social programs and scholarships for employees?" Jennifer checked her files, though she already knew the answer. "Less than $1 million. Richard stood up, walking over to the window. Below, the city stretched out like a giant board where he had played the business game for decades. "That changes today. I want you to prepare a presentation for the board. We are going to completely restructure our benefits and social responsibility policies." Meanwhile, at the hospital, Marcus was accompanying his mother's first session of the experimental treatment. Sarah was reclined in a special chair, connected to various equipment while a medical team monitored her response to the new medication. "How are you feeling, Mom?" Marcus asked, holding her hand. Sarah smiled, despite the evident fatigue. "Different. But it's a good different. You know, son, for the first time in a long time, I really feel hope." In the middle of the session, Marcus's phone vibrated. It was a message from the Human Resources Department at Richard's company. His interview for the internship program was scheduled for the following week. His heart raced with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. Back at the office, Richard faced his own battle. The board had called an emergency meeting to discuss his new proposals. 12 serious faces stared at him across the solid mahogany conference table. "Parker, have you lost your mind?" thundered Harold Blackwood, the oldest member of the board. "You want to allocate 30% of our profits to social programs? That's madness." Richard remained calm, though he could feel his heart protesting. "What's madness, Harold, is continuing to ignore our role in society. How many talents have we lost by not providing opportunities? How many Marcus Williams are out there just needing a chance?" "Marcus Williams?" another board member questioned. "Who is that?" Richard was about to respond when a sharp pain shot through his chest. The heart monitor beneath his shirt began beeping incessantly. Jennifer, sitting beside him, immediately noticed something was wrong. "Mr. Parker?" she called out, concerned. Richard tried to smile, but the pain was too intense. "I'm fine," he murmured, but his legs gave way. The conference room started spinning, and he leaned heavily on the table. "Call an ambulance," Jennifer shouted, rushing to support her boss. Within minutes, the building was in turmoil. Paramedics raced through the executive hallways, something that had never happened before. Richard, now lying on a stretcher, was still trying to give instructions. "Jennifer," he called weakly, "call Marcus. Tell him I need to see him." At the hospital, Marcus received the news with horror. He had just finished his mother's treatment session when his phone rang. "Mom, I have to go." "Mr. Parker." Sarah held her son's hand. "Go, dear. He needs you now." Marcus ran through the hospital corridors, his heart racing. When he arrived at the emergency department, he found Jennifer pacing back and forth, her usual professional demeanor replaced by genuine concern. "Marcus," she recognized him immediately. "The doctors are with him now. It was a heart attack, but he's stable. Can I see him?" Jennifer nodded, guiding him to the room. Richard was connected to several monitors, looking fragile and small in the hospital bed, an image that sharply contrasted with his usual imposing presence. "Marcus," Richard weakly called out upon seeing him. "Sorry for the scare. How did your mother's treatment go?" Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes. Even in this situation, Richard still cared about them. "It went well, Mr. Parker. But now I need you to recover. We still have a lot of work ahead." Richard tried to smile, but a new wave of pain made him squint his eyes. "Marcus, I need you to promise me something. Promise me you'll finish your studies no matter what happens. Promise me you'll take care of your mother and yourself." "Mr. Parker, don't talk like that. You're going to be fine." Richard gripped Marcus's arm with surprising strength. "Promise?" "I promise," Marcus replied, his voice choked. At that moment, the monitors began to beep furiously. The medical team rushed into the room, pushing Marcus out. Through the glass door, he watched helplessly as the doctors fought to stabilize Richard. Jennifer approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. He changed all the company policies yesterday, she said softly. He created a multi-million-dollar fund for scholarships and medical treatments. He said it was his legacy. Marcus sat in silence, watching the doctors work frantically. For the first time he realized that Richard wasn't just trying to help him, he was trying to change an entire system, using his wealth to make a real difference in the world. The following hours were a roller coaster of emotions. Richard was rushed into surgery, while Marcus and Jennifer waited, united in their concern. On the other side of the hospital, Sarah prayed for the man who had changed their lives. However, fate still had a few cards to play that night, and no one was prepared for what would come next. The waiting room of the surgical center was a limbo of anxiety and fear, illuminated by the cold, impersonal light of fluorescent bulbs. Marcus remained seated, motionless, watching the clock on the wall relentlessly mark each passing minute. Each tick-tock echoed in his ears as a cruel reminder of the fragility of life. Jennifer alternated between urgent calls and moments of tense silence, her normally composed face now marked by the deep concern that years of professionalism could no longer mask. The untouched coffee cooled in her hands as their minds wandered to recent moments. Richard, determined in his mission for change, his strong voice in the conference room, now replaced by the eerie silence of hospital corridors. Thomas Parker is on his way, Jennifer announced after hanging up another call, her voice betraying a slight tremor. I located him in London. He's catching the first available flight. Marcus looked up, noticing the additional tension on Jennifer's face when she mentioned the name. Thomas? Mr. Parker's son? Yes, Jennifer sighed heavily, sitting down for the first time in hours. They haven't spoken in years. The last time they saw each other was at Helen's funeral, and even then, well, it wasn't a pleasant meeting. The hours dragged on like decades in that sterile, impersonal environment. Every time the double doors of the surgical center opened with their characteristic creak, they both held their breath, only to see other doctors, other families, other stories pass by. The hallway felt like a stage where different dramas unfolded simultaneously, all united by the same fragile line between hope and despair. Near midnight, the sound of firm, determined footsteps echoed down the hallway. A tall, well-dressed man burst through the waiting room door, his expensive suit wrinkled from the rushed trip. His eyes, identical to Richard's, scanned the room until they landed on Jennifer. The resemblance to his father was striking. The same stature, the same commanding presence. But there was something different in his gaze, a hardness that Richard had recently lost. How is he? Thomas demanded, his voice a mix of barely contained anger and reluctant fear. Still in surgery, Jennifer answered softly, standing to greet him. Thomas, this is Marcus. Oh, so you're the boy, Thomas interrupted, his eyes narrowing dangerously. The new charity project of my father. The reason he suddenly decided to become a philanthropist and risk everything we've built. Marcus stood up slowly, maintaining his composure despite the evident hostility. His years of working in various services had taught him how to handle difficult people, but this situation was different. There was much more at stake. Mr. Parker, your father is an extraordinary man who... My father, Thomas cut in again, his voice heavy with bitterness, is a manipulator who always knew exactly how to make people dance to his tune. What did he promise you? Money? A career? That's how he operates. He buys people with promises and discards them when they're no longer useful. Jennifer tried to intervene, stepping between the two men. Thomas, that's not fair. You don't know? Fair? He laughed bitterly, running his hand through his hair in a gesture that closely resembled his father's. You know what isn't fair? Spending your whole life trying to earn the approval of a man who only cares about numbers on a spreadsheet. Who missed his own wife's funeral, my mother, because he had an important meeting he couldn't postpone. Who measured love in quarterly results and corporate successes. Marcus felt a wave of indignation rising in his chest. Thomas's words painted a completely different picture of the man he had known. You're wrong, he said firmly, his voice low but intense. Your father is a man trying to fix his mistakes. He has acknowledged his faults and his... The doors to the operating room opened once again, interrupting the confrontation. A doctor in surgical scrubs approached the group, his face grave and tired after hours of surgery. The silence that followed was deafening. Family of Mr. Parker? Thomas stepped forward, instinctively adjusting his tie. I'm his son. Mr. Parker, we've managed to stabilize your father, but the situation is critical. The damage to his heart was extensive, more than we initially thought. The next 24 hours will be crucial. To be honest, we're doing everything we can, but I need you to be prepared for any outcome. The doctor continued explaining the technical details of the surgery and Richard's current condition, but Marcus could barely hear. His thoughts were with Richard, fighting for his life somewhere beyond those doors. A man who had completely changed his life and his mother's life, who was trying to make a difference in the world, now dependent on machines to breathe. He was asking to see you, the doctor said, looking directly at Marcus. Before being sedated for surgery, he insisted. He mentioned something about promises and assurances. Thomas shot a cutting glance at Marcus, his eyes filled with a mix of jealousy and resentment. Of course, always putting strangers before family. Some things never change. Maybe, Marcus replied calmly, meeting Thomas's gaze without hesitation, because some strangers know how to value what family takes for granted. Your father isn't trying to buy anyone, he's trying to make a difference. Something money alone can't buy. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas seemed momentarily disconcerted, as if Marcus's words had struck a sensitive chord in his armor of cynicism and bitterness. At that moment, Jennifer's phone rang again, breaking the tension momentarily. Her face paled as she listened. "It's from the office," she said after hanging up, her voice trembling slightly. "The board is calling an emergency meeting. They want to vote to remove Mr. Parker from the presidency. They're saying he's not fit to lead the company, that his recent decisions show a lack of discernment. They can't do that." Marcus protested, indignation clear in his voice. "He's sick, fighting for his life, and they want to take advantage of this moment too." "They can," Thomas replied, a bitter smile on his lips. "And they'll use my vote to make it happen. As the majority shareholder after my father, my vote will be decisive." Marcus stared at Thomas in disbelief, taking a step toward him. "Your own father is fighting for his life just a few feet away, and you're going to help take from him the company he built? The company he sacrificed everything for, including his family? You don't understand anything, kid," Thomas shot back, but his voice faltered slightly. "My father always put that company ahead of everything and everyone. Now, suddenly he wants to throw it all away because of social programs and charity? He wants to risk a lifetime of work because of a chance encounter with a stranger? No," Marcus responded firmly, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised everyone. "He wants to leave a legacy that matters. He wants to use his success to make a difference in people's lives. Your father is trying to fix his mistakes, including with you. He told me about your mother's funeral, about how that regret consumes him every day." Thomas remained silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the operating room doors. The conflict was visible on his face. Decades of hurt battling against the possibility of reconciliation. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, softer, almost vulnerable. "What was the last thing he said? Before the surgery?" Jennifer responded gently, unshed tears shimmering in her eyes. "He said, 'Tell Thomas I'm sorry. For everything. Tell him I understand now what really matters.'" Thomas's face tightened with contained emotion, and for a moment, the hard-nosed executive mask slipped, revealing the boy still seeking his father's approval. Suddenly, a piercing alarm went off at the nursing station. The medical team rushed to Richard's room, their hurried footsteps echoing down the silent corridor. Marcus, Thomas, and Jennifer watched helplessly as the professionals once again fought for Richard Parker's life. It was the moment of truth, not just for Richard but for everyone there. The choices made in the coming hours would determine not only the fate of a company but the legacy of a man who had finally discovered the true meaning of wealth. And perhaps, more importantly, it was a final chance for a father and son to resolve decades of misunderstandings and unspoken hurts. Dawn found the small group still at the hospital, exhausted but united in a vigil that had profoundly changed them all. Richard Parker had survived the night, though he remained in critical condition. The golden light of the rising sun filtered through the hospital windows, bringing with it a new day and new possibilities. Thomas stood by his father's bed, watching the rhythmic motion of the ventilator. Throughout the long night, something had changed within him. Marcus's words and the near loss of his father had broken through layers of resentment built over decades. "You know," Thomas said softly to Marcus, who was on the other side of the bed, "I spent so much time angry at him that I almost forgot what it was like to admire him. When I was a kid, he was my hero." Marcus listened in silence, respecting Thomas's moment of vulnerability. The beeping of the heart monitors marked a steady rhythm in the background, like a soundtrack to the confessions of the night. "I remember the day he first took me to the office," Thomas continued, a sad smile playing on his lips. "I was 10 years old. He sat me in his chair and said, 'One day, son, all of this will be yours.' At the time, it seemed like the most important thing in the world. Jennifer entered the room quietly, carrying coffee for everyone. "The board is waiting for your decision, Thomas," she said softly. "The meeting starts in an hour." Thomas nodded, his eyes still fixed on his unconscious father. "You know what's ironic?" he asked, more to himself than to the others. "For years all I wanted was for him to see beyond the money, beyond the business. And now that he's finally done that, I'm about to punish him for it." Marcus stood up, facing Thomas directly. "There's still time to do the right thing. Your father found his redemption by helping me, maybe this is your chance to find yours." The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected sound, a faint groan coming from the bed. Richard's eyes began to move under his eyelids, and his fingers twitched slightly. "Dad?" Thomas called, leaning over the bed. "Dad, can you hear me?" Richard's eyes slowly opened, taking a moment to focus. When he finally spoke, his voice was just a whisper. "Thomas, you came?" "Of course I came," Thomas replied, his voice choked. "I'm your son." Richard tried to smile through the oxygen mask. "Forgive me, for everything?" "No, Dad," Thomas interrupted, holding his father's hand. "I'm the one who needs to ask for forgiveness. For not understanding, for not seeing that you were finally doing the right thing." "The company?" Richard began, but Thomas interrupted him again. "The company is safe. I'll support your changes. In fact," he glanced at Marcus, "I think we can do even more. Expand the social programs, create more opportunities." Richard's eyes filled with tears. With effort, he extended his other hand to Marcus. "Thank you," he whispered, "for showing me the way." In the days that followed, Richard's recovery was slow but steady. The board meeting, under Thomas's new leadership, not only upheld Richard's proposed changes but expanded the company's social programs even further. Marcus returned to engineering school, now with a full scholarship and a guaranteed internship. His mother continued her experimental treatment, showing significant improvements each week. The old wheelchair was replaced with a cane, and her smile once again lit up the days of everyone around her. 6 months later, on a sunny afternoon, Richard stood in the company's auditorium, leaning on a cane, but his eyes shining with pride. Beside him, Thomas smiled as he presented the new scholarship and healthcare program for employees and their families. In the front row, Marcus and his mother watched the ceremony, their hands intertwined in silent gratitude. Sarah, now able to take a few steps on her own, smiled through her tears. "Today," Richard began his speech, his voice stronger every day, "we are not just launching a social program, but a new way of doing business. A way that recognizes that true wealth is not in the numbers of a bank account, but in the lives we can touch and transform." He paused, looking at Marcus and Sarah, then at his son. "I've learned, through extraordinary circumstances, that sometimes we have to lose everything to find what truly matters. True wealth lies in the connections we make, the lives we transform, and the legacy we leave." Thomas approached his father, placing a hand on his shoulder in a gesture of support and affection that would have been unthinkable months before. Together, father and son had found a new purpose, a new way to honor the empire Richard had built. The scholarship program was named after Helen Parker, in honor of the woman who always believed that there was more to life than financial success. The first group of scholarship recipients included 50 talented young people from diverse backgrounds, each with their own story of overcoming adversity. That evening, after the ceremony, Richard sat in his renovated office, now decorated with photos of his family and the first beneficiaries of the social programs. On his desk, beside the financial reports, was a drawing made by one of the children helped by the new medical program, a constant reminder of the true value of his work. The view of the city at sunset looked different now. It was no longer an empire of concrete and glass, but a field of possibilities, of lives to be transformed, of dreams to be realized. And so, through a chance encounter on a rainy night, two families found not only healing and redemption but also a new purpose. Richard Parker discovered that his true legacy would not be measured in dollars and cents, but in the lives he helped transform. Thomas found the father he had always longed for, and together they were building something greater than any financial empire. As for Marcus and Sarah, they were living proof that true wealth lies not in what we own, but in what we share with others. Their lives, transformed by the generosity of a stranger, now served as an inspiration to others who, like them, only needed an opportunity to shine. The sun set over the city, marking the end of another day and the beginning of a new era, an era where business success and social responsibility walked hand in hand, proving that it is possible to build an empire without losing humanity. And so, friends, what did you think of this story of transformation and redemption? Richard, Marcus, and their family's journey shows us that sometimes the most unexpected encounters can completely change our lives. What would you have done in Marcus's place on that rainy night? Or how would you have reacted if you were in Thomas's position? Don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments. We love hearing what you think and discussing these stories with you. If you were moved and want more intense stories like this, give us a like and subscribe to the Life Stories channel. It helps our channel grow and allows us to bring more exciting adventures to you. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming inspiring stories. And share with friends and family. After all, you never know who might need to hear a story like this today. Until the next story, everyone.